90% of the Native Americans were wiped out. Massacres, war, fraud, contracts that were agreed to that blatantly violated. You live free because your ancestors were ruthless. Look at how America became the technological leader. Through stealing technology, through espionage, through violating the IP rights of Europe. All free republics must be built in this way. Experiments put nature under stress in the same way you would torture a prisoner to juice out the truth. Corrupt people can be eliminated, according to Machiavelli. They can be shocked. They can be awed. They cannot be reasoned with. Machiavelli really dislikes the elites. All the deserving need to be punished. Not all who are punished need to be deserving.
America is the land of freedom. She's the protector of self-evident rights. In my mind, there can be no doubt about America's genuine achievement in world history. How then do we make sense of her founding, of the systematic elimination of the natives' freedoms whose rights were not so evident? America's founding act violated her most deeply held principle. How do we make sense of this? This is the paradox that the great Machiavelli scholar Leo Strauss introduces to help us tease out Machiavelli's central political insight. Principles need to be violated in order to be actualized. It's not hypocrisy, it's necessity. For Strauss, as for Machiavelli, the modern left and right are both deluded about America's founding. The right wants to whitewash, whereas the left wants to denounce. But neither own up to the actual cost of doing politics in the real world. In this lecture, I will withhold my own opinion and critiques for the end, but not before explaining the terrifying cost of building an equal, free, and lawful society, according to Machiavelli.
I quote to you the great Machiavelli scholar Leo Strauss. Machiavelli would argue that America owes her greatness not only to her habitual adherence to the principles of freedom and justice, but also to her occasional deviation from them. He would not hesitate to suggest a mischievous interpretation of the fate of the Red Indians. There cannot be a great and glorious society without the equivalent of the murder of Remus by his brother Romulus. So I'm gonna save, as always, my personal reservations, and believe me, there's a lot, towards the end of this lecture. And we're gonna start just by trying to understand the most charitable interpretation of Machiavelli. And we're gonna do it by unpacking Strauss's example here. So what is he gesturing at, this mischievous interpretation of the founding of America? Up to 90% of the Native Americans were wiped out in the first phase through contact of disease alone, okay? Think about 10 of your best friends and family, 9 of them dead. And then came a brutal, centuries-long westward push. Massacres, war, fraud, contracts that were agreed to that blatantly violated. By the time the frontier closed, only a sliver of the native population was still surviving. And it was not much better for those who survived. Families were confined to reserves. Children were ripped out of those families, forced into boarding schools, punished for practicing their own religion, speaking their own language, until the native way of life was all but eliminated. Why does Strauss think Machiavelli would highlight this fact of founding? Is it to condemn America? No, not even close. We can tease out what Machiavelli would say about America's founding, as Strauss suggests, by seeing what Machiavelli has said about the founding of Rome. Rome, too, was founded on at least 2 crimes. The first crime, Romulus literally killing his brother, Remus. The second crime, Rome subjugated, colonized, enslaved her way to greatness. And the way she did it was absolutely treacherous. Machiavelli tells us when Rome was just a small city-state, what it did was it invited the city-states around it to become her junior partners, okay? You get to keep all of your ruling class. You get to keep your laws, most of your property, your language, your religion, but you listen to us. And what Rome commanded her junior partners to do was to go further out and subjugate the people in further regions. So not as inviting them as junior partners, but getting them in as subjects, killing off the ruling class, taking their land. enslaving some of them, absorbing others as citizens. And when Rome's junior partners collected enough subjects for her, Rome turned on those junior partners with the very subjects she got and subjugated everyone until Rome ruled alone. Blatant fraud is the heart of Rome's greatness. This is what Machiavelli tells us. And a not too dissimilar strategy was used by America in her expansion, okay? And the most infamous example of this is the Creek War. In the Creek War, Andrew Jackson, as general, was fighting against the Creeks. And one of the pivotal reasons he won was because he allied himself with the Cherokee tribe, the Cherokees who helped America defeat the Creeks. A Cherokee leader even saved Andrew Jackson's life. Andrew Jackson called the Cherokee "my dear and faithful friends." Now, Andrew Jackson becomes president, and he pushes through the Indian Removal Act, which would exile the Cherokee from the native land, his own allies who saved his life. It would exile them from their native land that they've been living for centuries and push them west. What makes this even more treacherous is that the Cherokee at this point had done everything they were supposed to do to assimilate, okay? They adopted a written constitution, modeled after the US's constitution. They created a written alphabet. Many of them even stopped practicing their own native religion and rituals and converted to Christianity. The Cherokee literally had treaties with the American government recognizing its sovereignty, okay? So the Cherokee, again, they did everything they were supposed to do. They fight this legally, not through terrorism, they fight it legally. They take it to the Supreme Court. It's a bit nuanced, but eventually the Supreme Court sides with the Cherokee. Okay, they recognize the Cherokee's authority over what Jackson said. What does Jackson do? He ignores the Supreme Court. He does an under-the-table deal with an illegitimate group of Cherokee leaders that get them to sign over the land in an illegitimate treaty and use that as legitimacy to exile them from their land. This resulted in the infamous Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee were exiled from their native land. A quarter of them died on the journey as they went out west. Why did they go out west? Because the government told them, west of the Mississippi, native land forever. Machiavelli's lesson about the founding of Rome is this: Rome could not have been the free state par excellence, a beacon of freedom inspiring all the great nations that have come since, if she actually respected the freedom of others. And if you are going to conquer, if you are going to go to war, I quote you Machiavelli, to use fraud in managing war is a glorious thing. It's a lot more humane than bloodshed, is it not? And Strauss's point of bringing Machiavelli in the American context is similarly to say, if you want to build a shining city on that hill right there, and there already is a city on that hill right there, it's going to be you or them. That's the choice in front of you. I quote to you Machiavelli. There is no secure mode to possess a free people other than to ruin them. And whoever becomes patron of a city, accustomed to living free and does not destroy it, should expect to be destroyed by it. Strauss brings in Machiavelli then as a third distinctive voice in American politics on America's founding. One voice that Strauss wants to use Machiavelli to combat is the one he associates with Thomas Paine, the founding father. And this voice sees America as a shining exception, a moral exemplar of freedom, of respecting rights in the history of all nations. This is the voice of the modern right. And what they do is they try to downplay the founding, right? It was mostly disease. They were fighting amongst each other already. Or better yet, let's not talk about it. Okay, let's not teach too much about it in our curriculum in schools. That's one voice that Strauss wants to combat. The other voice he wants to combat is that of the modern left. And these people, they don't downplay the founding. They expose the founding as a battering ram of America, right? Bad America, bad. You should be ashamed of your ancestors, tear down their statues, paint over their portraits. For Machiavelli, both of these voices are equally diluted. The right does not own up to the brutality, whereas the left, in its moral critique, is implicitly assuming it could have been otherwise. That you can build your shining city on the hill, you can keep the original city on the hill, and everyone can dance and sing Kumbaya. And this is not just an intellectual problem, okay, for Machiavelli. It is a deeply practical problem, because both ways of thinking produce weak men who aren't willing to do what is necessary. Machiavelli then highlights the brutality of the founding, not to condemn your ancestors, but to empower you, in the same way that he held up the brutality of Rome's founding for his fellow Italians to imitate. We are in a maintenance phase, okay? And his point is, in maintenance phases, it is easy to adhere to freedom, to respect human rights. But on the up and up, like Jackson, like early Rome, that's when violating principles for Machiavelli become necessary. So here's another example. It's not about America's geography, but her technology, okay? So right now, America is the great defender of fair trade and intellectual property. Why? It's easy to do so when you are the technological leader. But Machiavelli would say, dig a bit deeper, okay? Look at how America became the technological leader. Through stealing technology, through espionage, through violating the IP rights of Europe. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, instituted a program of industrial espionage. America, as an agrarian society at the time, was struggling to catch up with the industrial powers of Europe, especially of Britain. And respecting fair trade and intellectual property was not going to get it there. What did get America there? An IP regime that refused to recognize foreign IP. Hamilton proposed a bounty system that essentially bribes Europeans to steal their technology and bring to America. Hamilton's assistant talked with mechanics, wrote pamphlets, placed notices, and created entire campaigns in Britain to court their tech talent, to sharing know-how, or to just outright immigrating. Of course, Britain doesn't want this. They made it legal. It got so bad, they had to check all the personal luggage that was going out of their ports because people were smuggling machine drawings out of Britain. What did Hamilton do? Did he care that he was violating existing IP rights? Did he care that he was violating the sovereignty of another nation? No, it had to be done. And the campaign he created worked. One of the people that came over through this campaign was called Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater was a textile worker who memorized the latest textile machinery, which he smuggled to America through himself because he memorized it, and he went off to engender the American Industrial Revolution. Now, the point is not all America's technology is from stealing, but the scholarly consensus is this phase of stealing and catching up was instrumental. Just to give you an example of how important this was, just one person alone, Samuel Slater, is called the father of the American Industrial Revolution, okay? In the UK, he's known as Slater the Traitor. So Machiavelli's point is that it is tough and ruthless men like Hamilton, like Jackson, who are willing to violate their deepest principles that can actually get you to a place of strength where you can actually respect and protect those principles. Tough men make peaceful times. But Machiavelli thinks in peaceful times, people tend to forget this, okay? They tend to think, oh, look, all that brutality, all that stealing, all that lying, all that deceit was not necessary. So they do two things. Like the right, they whitewash it, or like the left, they start condemning their own ancestors. Peaceful times for Machiavelli make weak men. So in order not to have those weak men make tough times, Machiavelli's role as teacher is to constantly remind you that principles need to be violated in order to be realized, because the political world is dirty, it's not perfect. And if Machiavelli were designing a textbook for America's leaders today, it would be filled with examples like Jackson, like Hamilton, and their ruthlessness for them to imitate, in the same way that his books for his fellow Italians are filled with examples of the ruthless princes of antiquity, especially of Rome. I quote to you Machiavelli. We ought not reprove anyone for any extraordinary action that he uses to order a kingdom or constitute a republic. It is very suitable that when the deed accuses him, the effect excuses him. And when the effect is good, as was that of Romulus, it will always excuse the deed. And what makes all of this even more terrifying, and I do find it terrifying, and again, I'm going to leave my personal reservations at the end. What makes all of this even more terrifying is that Machiavelli isn't just trying to teach us a general lesson of principles in general need to be violated. He's saying our specific values need to be violated. More than first meets the eye, Machiavelli actually agrees with our political principles: equality, freedom, rule of law. Other than just a pure survival in an orderly state, those are the three most important values for Machiavelli's political philosophy. By the way, this is the only reason why Machiavelli is worth engaging. He's not just out there teaching thugs like some kind of ancient motivational guru trying to teach you how to get ahead. That wouldn't be interesting. That's not a great book. He has values, he has ends he's trying to realize. And the ends aren't alien ends. They're not tyranny, they're not bloodlust. They are our ends. And so we must read Machiavelli as a direct challenge to our own complacency. You want to build an equal, free, lawful society? Get ready to do some very dirty deeds. So now that we got this central intuition down, principles need to be violated in order to be realized. And hopefully you also realize just how relevant his writing is directly to us. We're going to spend the rest of this lecture going through each of our core principles and seeing why they require their opposites, okay? So in part one, we think that equality means rule by the people, but it actually requires singular leadership from great men. Part two, freedom. We think freedom comes from union, it comes from harmony. It's actually going to come from conflict, both domestic, institutionalized class conflict, and international, foreign wars and expansions. And lastly, rule of law. We think rule of law means respecting the law, maybe protests, at most civil disobedience if you're feeling extra naughty. But for him, rule of law requires excessive and often extra-legal killings and violence to be sustained. Okay, let's begin with part one. And again, the claim here is going to be equality needs great men. And before I can help you understand why Machiavelli thinks equality needs great men, I need to help you understand in what way he's an egalitarian in the first place, right? Because when we think Machiavelli, the first thing that pops into our mind is not egalitarian, but he is. In fact, this is one of his most radical innovations upon classical political theory, which he himself explicitly recognizes, okay? He says this, Discourses 158. I wish to defend a thing that, as I said, has been accused by all the writers. This is the strongest he ever goes, self-consciously, about his own innovations, and it's his egalitarianism. And what's even stranger is that Machiavelli is an egalitarian. He likes the people for the exact reason everyone before him does not like the people. The people have good political judgment. And even stranger still, Machiavelli thinks the people have good political judgment for the exact reason the classical authors think they don't, because the people are vulgar, okay? I quote you Machiavelli. Men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands, because seeing is given to everyone, touching to few. Everyone sees how you appear. Few touch what you are. So let a prince win and maintain his state. The means will always be judged honorable and will be praised by everyone, for the vulgar are taken in by the appearance and the outcome of a thing. And in the world, there was no one but the vulgar. People are vulgar. They care about appearances, not essence. People are vulgar. They care about outcomes and not intention. So Machiavelli says the vulgar people, the way they judge a political leader, three criterion in descending order. Number one, what have you actually done? What are your accomplishments? What's the outcome? Not what you intended, what was the actual outcome? In the absence of that, they're going to judge you by the friends you associate with. In the absence of that, They're going to judge you by your family legacy and your lineage. So that's how the vulgar judge. That's who they like. But then the obvious question for Machiavelli is, why is that a good thing? Okay? Why is it better that the people judge on outcome and not intention, appearance and not essence? Because that is what politics is. It is about outcomes. It is about appearance. What's important is that Jackson got you guys your land, not how he got it. What's important is that Romulus founded Rome, not his fratricide. I quote to you Machiavelli. It has appeared to me more fitting to go directly to the effectual truth of the thing than to the imagination of it. And many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth. Who Machiavelli has in mind in his crosshairs with that phrase, imagined republics, right, are the wise men of antiquity, the very classical authors he's saying he's radically breaking away from. That's the philosophical tradition, right? Think Plato, Callipolis, that's an imagined republic. Think Augustine, City of God, that's another imagined republic. And Machiavelli is saying here, you guys look down on the people and their vulgarity. Their vulgarity is actually a better judge of political leadership than your sophistication. Why? It's because the wise men, they honor noble losers, okay? If your friends are Stoics, Stoics believe that the outcomes don't affect their happiness, they will honor you, they will esteem you, even if you lose virtuously, right? The virtuous slave, we are told, is just as happy as the virtuous emperor. If you seek the approval of fellow Christians, you will be esteemed, even if you lose politically and you're martyred, right? Martyrs are esteemed in Christianity. Why? Because there is the next life, right? Because there is God's glory. There's eternal glory that matters a lot more than worldly glory. Machiavelli hates this otherworldly aspect of Christianity and the philosophical tradition. And he thinks we can't afford to have noble losers as our political leaders. We need winners. Noble or ignoble, we need winners. And to make this contrast between the kind of Christian Platonic sophistication and the kind of vulgarity he has in mind, go look at the accounts of the barbarian conversions to Christianity. They're hilarious, okay? So these like big Gallic warriors, who, I'm imagining like a huge beard, a big battle axe, right? Pinnacle of vulgarity, they're barbarians. And you have this nerdy Christian missionary trying to convert them. And when they're successful, the Christian missionaries tells them about the crucifixion. And without skipping a beat, the barbarian chiefs just go, if me and my boys were there, it would have been different. We would have saved him off the cross, okay? We would have avenged him and sacked Rome. And I think Machiavelli wants to say, okay, that's not the point of Christianity. He kind of had to like die in atonement, but that's the right attitude, right? I like your attitude, right? That's what he'd say to the barbarians. I like your attitude, right? That's the kind of vulgarity that Machiavelli likes. And so this is why the vulgar make good political judgments, because they're not caught up in these silly ideas. They're not caught up in virtue or the next life. And this is why it is good that you as a political leader do not care about the respect of those who respect you, do not care the esteem of the wise men, and chase after vulgar worldly glory, because those mechanisms are actually more aligned with the logic of politics. But I didn't say the people's judgment were infallible, okay? They're simply good enough. Vulgarity is good enough, but there's a downside to vulgarity, which is that they will be taken in by the appearance. And specifically, the types of appearance the people are usually taken in by is big, bold action, okay? So they usually are fooled into fighting a war when really they should negotiate. They're usually fooled into spectacles and festivals when they should be austere. The trade-off of judging by appearance is that you will be deceived by appearances. And furthermore, Machiavelli believes that for the people to exercise their political judgment well, there needs to be a set of institutional conditions. But the point is, we're not trying to choose the next pope here, okay? We're not trying to figure out which saint to canonize. We're trying to choose a political leader. And think about the types of leaders that Machiavelli elevates. Romulus, someone who killed his own brother to secure his power. Vulgarity, even when it overlooks clear and blatant moral violations, is a good thing, because that's actually the kind of leader you want. And if you say to Machiavelli, "What are you talking about, man? You can't build a free republic in this way. This is not how a free leader should act," Machiavelli would say to you, think about Andrew Jackson, defrauding America's allies, illegitimate deals in unauthorized channels, literally breaking and violating the law of the Supreme Court. Not only can free republics be built this way, your free republic was built in this way. And even stronger, all free republics must be built in this way. That's what he would say to that. This is why he is so intent on uncovering the treachery of founding, okay? Be it Rome, be it Israel, be it Persia, be it Athens. And this is something that is extremely underappreciated in Machiavelli. Just how much selfish and conventionally bad people make for good leaders. The best type of selfishness you want in your leaders is glory, okay? If your leader likes glory, you hit the jackpot. Because glory is gonna make them benefit the state, not for you, but for their own gain, even at the expense of their brute self-interest. But even brute self-interest, even just a brute self-interested leader, even just a tyrant, Machiavelli wants to say, don't underestimate how much alignment there actually is there with the interests of the people. An example he uses here is Agathocles. Agathocles is a bastard of a man, okay? He was the tyrant of Syracuse. He betrayed his friends. He killed all these people that he didn't have to kill. Machiavelli condemns Agathocles, but he can't help but add a sentence, and still, in some very significant ways, he benefited Syracuse. Why? Because the tyrant also wants order in his state. Because the tyrant also doesn't want to be conquered by foreign foes. Because the tyrant also wants to get rid of people who are thieves and criminals and causing trouble in his society. This is far, very far from saying all bad people make good leaders. But I think Machiavelli would say the reverse. All conventionally good people make terrible leaders. They don't have the guts to do what is necessary to build the damn state that you enjoy. You'd prefer a tyrant over a conventionally good person who is too weak. Vulgarity is good enough. All right, summarize where we're at. The whole point of this lecture is to understand why principles need to be violated in order to be realized. Part one is to help you understand why equality needs great men. Before we do that, we need to understand why Machiavelli is an egalitarian in the first place. The first reason is that the people have good political judgment. And the first reason for why that is because they're vulgar, okay? Now we're gonna move on to the second reason why people have good political judgment, and that's that they're less biased than the elites. And just to be clear here, so the people are the ones that judge by sight, okay? The elites are the ones that judge by touch. So the elites actually have what we can call better raw political judgment. The elites are even further from the deluded wise men. They're even more realpolitik. The issue with the elites is they have way too many self-interests that eventually bias their better raw judgment. Okay, so here's an example. I have a friend, when he wasn't successful, he criticized just about anyone. Okay, every country, every religion, every company, he held no holds back. Now that he's become very, very successful, he's silenced himself. Why? Not because his raw political judgments have changed, but because now his company is doing business with every other company. Now his company needs a headquarters in every country. He doesn't want to offend anyone. And this is Machiavelli's point. The people are like my friend before his success. They got no bias because they got no interests because they're impoverished. The elites are my friend after his success. Even if they know a certain candidate is better for a country, they might not care about the country's interests over their own, right? The prince fears other great men, whereas the people, they're not threatened by them because they weren't even in competition in the first place. And Machiavelli says, freedom is better protected in the hands of the people because the elites seek to oppress, the people only seek not to be oppressed. But that is not a moral claim, okay? The difference here is not essential, it's positional. And what I mean by that is think about this. America, when it was the technology laggard, violated IP. America, when it is the technology leader, protects IP. That's what it means, positional, not essential. In like manner, the people's morality come from their position. They are simply too many of them to coordinate, to act fast enough. They are simply too sluggish, and they can't even oppress and coordinate that if they wanted to. But even stronger, the people are so impoverished, they are so threatened that they're just happy to be alive and protect what they already have. The people's poverty, sluggishness, and mass means that they're less biased in the first place, they're more easily corrected if they end up in error, and there's a nice kind of decentralized wisdom of the crowds effect. I quote to you Machiavelli. Not without cause may the voice of the people be likened to that of God. This is how highly he speaks of the people. For one sees a universal opinion produce marvelous effects in its forecasts, so that it appears to foresee its ill and its good by a hidden virtue. Okay, so it turns out that the people have good political judgment, not only because they are vulgar, but because they're also impoverished, sluggish, and massive, okay? And this makes their political judgment especially good at two kinds of things. The first one is maintaining, conserving rather than innovating, and the second one is judging by particularities instead of generalities, okay? I'll tell you a story of what I mean here. So the story is about an episode in the Second Punic War, Rome against Carthage. Capua, one of these allied Italian city-states, they had just heard that Rome was defeated pretty badly by Hannibal of Carthage. And the people before this, they already hated the elites, the Senate, because they wanted to ally to the Carthaginian side. And after this was the last straw, okay? The people were ready to riot and kill all the senators. Now, one of the key magistrates takes this information and he goes to the senators and he says, look, you guys are toast, okay? You guys are dead. What I'm gonna propose now is probably the only thing that can save your sorry asses. I'm gonna lock all you guys in the Senate House. I'm gonna tell the people, you can have your revenge. It's hunting season. But it's only fair if you're able to, every time you kill a senator, you suggest a new one to replace him from your ranks. That seems fair, right? We still need a Senate. There's a war that still needs to be fought. The elites agree to this. They really don't have any choice. And the people come in front of the Senate House. And the magistrate explains the rules to the people, and he starts pulling out essentially names of the senators one by one. And we're told every time a name was chosen, you would hear boos, you would hear off with his head, you would hear all these shouts, and the magistrate goes, okay, we can do that. But remember, pick one from your own to better replace him. And we are told, inevitably, someone would shout out a plebeian name, and then the crowd would start laughing. Okay? This guy, no way he could run that office. And then the nice kind of wisdom of crowns effect comes in and says, no, he has all these different issues, he's a drunkard. And they go through the entire Senate. Not a single person was killed, exiled, or replaced. This is the peak example Machiavelli uses of the good judgment of the people. The people, because of their vulgarity, they can actually tell, look, my friend Tom is not going to be as good leading us in battle as the senator over there, because they're so outcome-oriented, okay? And even more importantly, because of their poverty, their mass, their decentralization, their initial desire for vengeance doesn't get in the way of that correct judgment being expressed. And Machiavelli says, if a prince were as vengeful as the people were in the beginning of that episode, good luck talking him off a cliff. But the only reason that the people judged well is because certain institutional conditions existed in Capua, okay? Number one, they were in a state of necessity. They knew they had a war coming on their doorsteps. Number two, they still had existing public channels of communication that they trusted and public magistrates to facilitate decisions that they still trusted. And number three, and this is what I mean by generality versus particularity, the magistrate didn't go and ask the people, oh, what is justice? Okay, what's the Carthaginian strategy versus the Roman strategy? You just put two people in front of them. Which one do you want? That's what people are good at judging. They're vulgar, particularities. Okay, summarize where we're at. We want to understand why equality needs great men. We first need to understand why he's an egalitarian, why he likes equality in the first place. And the first reason is because the people have good political judgment. The second reason is that Machiavelli really dislikes the elites, and he thinks that they are the source of corruption most of the time. Okay. And so now I think I need to be a bit more specific than I have been. By elites, I don't mean the prince. I don't mean the executive. I don't mean the president. I don't mean the singular ruler. I mean the aristocratic class, the oligarchic class that mostly separates themselves with the people on the vector of wealth. Okay. It's this class that is the cause of the problem. Why? Well, Machiavelli believes that in a highly unequal, hierarchical society, great talent gets ignored. Okay, so it's a very simple point about meritocracy. And Machiavelli is speaking not only from personal experience, but also perhaps some resentment. Because before he wrote these books, The Prince, the Discourses, he was a political leader of sorts in Florence, and he often experienced what we would call today class discrimination. Okay, so one example, he trained this militia against the elites. The elites didn't want to do this, which eventually sacked Pisa. Great political achievement. On the marble commemorating the victory, it was the elites' names that campaigned against the creation of this militia that was on there, and not Machiavelli's name. Another example, Machiavelli was tapped to be the ambassador to the German emperor. And then he was vetoed by the elites. Someone of better birth, because they were better birth, was selected instead. Okay, so those are the situations, and that's the kind of hierarchy he hates. And because of this, Machiavelli has a lot less of an issue with the Venetian nobility because they come out of trade. They're a lot more fluid. What he really hates is gentlemen, landed gentry, people who are able to enjoy leisure from generation to generation because of their self-sustaining inheritance. Okay. And you can see there just how far we are from someone like Aristotle. But raw inequality itself is not the only issue. Because when we hear about inequality today, okay, the people here, the elites here, we often think, well, let's bring the people up. Let's make everyone wealthy. But Machiavelli actually says, let's bring the elites down. Let's make everyone poor. So sometimes he does speak positively of wealth, like Discourses 2:2. But the following quote is how he mostly speaks about wealth. The most useful thing that may be ordered in a free way of life is that the citizens be kept poor. Why? Because wealth, even independently of inequality, corrupts a state in two ways. The first way is that wealth can overcome virtue as the most important thing that people care about. So it's no longer political acumen, it's no longer martial prowess, it becomes the acquisition of luxuries that people start caring about. That's the first reason. The second reason is that wealth removes necessity. Again, think back to Capua. They made the right decision because they were on the brink of war. Machiavelli's attack on wealth and proposal for austerity then sound downright Paleolithic to our ears, right? But even in our, I think, hyper-capitalist, materialist world, I think we can find intuitions, okay? So take Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Even when they had enough funding to buy desks, they still use this makeshift desk, which is just like a door they got somewhere, with 4 planks underneath. And they used that not because they were running out of money later on, but because austerity, material austerity, sends a kind of message to the people, and it's spiritually healthy for a polity. But keeping the private poor is only half of the equation. The other half of the equation, where does that money go? Is to keep the public rich, okay? And that he mostly means the military. So Sparta, early Rome, those are the kinds of martial states that he has in mind. And the best story from this is Cincinnatus, okay? Cincinnatus was a Roman patrician, and he was a general. He eventually was dictator, and Rome had lost a series of wars. The Senate elected him to be dictator to continue fighting those wars. What was he doing when he was told of this? He was a sustenance farmer in the most ragged of clothes, farming on his own land. That was only 2.5 acres, okay? The American slaves were offered 40 acres in the Civil War. They didn't get it, but they were offered, okay? So think about that. The top Roman guy, 2.5 acres. Now, the Senate calls him, be dictator, fight our wars for us. And he goes, he wins the war, he rejects all the honors, he goes back to his 2.5 acres, and he continues farming. That's the kind of martial prowess that austerity provides. And herein lies the third reason, okay, that Machiavelli is an egalitarian, and that's war. So the first reason is that people have good political judgment. The second reason is that the elites corrupt society. They're a corrupting force in society. And the third reason is that egalitarianism is good for war. Why? Because it's the people who are going to be manning the army. You got to give them arms, right? You got to train them. If you want to fight a war, you can't choose talent off of merely class. You got to pick the best ones you got. Both of these are egalitarian forces. Now, why does he want war? Why is making war good? I have a completely separate lecture just on what we can call Machiavelli's foreign political philosophy, his foreign policy. This lecture is on his domestic political philosophy, his domestic policy, so I won't rehash all the arguments there, except to say Machiavelli hopes that war can replace commerce as the channel of ambition. That instead of a culture idolizing luxury, there's instead a culture that glorifies martial prowess. And his insight is that by giving men channels to win glory in war, that will satisfy their appetite to win glory through commerce. Think about Cincinnatus. Why is one of the most talented men content being a poor farmer on 2.5 acres of land? It's because he has all the glory and recognition he needs from the state from being a military general, right? And I want to highlight that because I think it's so fascinating because it's the opposite of what modernity wants, right? We want people to channel their ambition into commerce so that they're exhausted and they don't have a need to win glory through war. All right, summarize where we're at. We now have an understanding of why Machiavelli is an egalitarian. It's good for war. He distrusts the elite, and the people have good political judgment. And that makes Machiavelli, I think, quite an odd egalitarian. Because if you ask a modern egalitarian today, why do you like the people? They're going to say, well, it's because the people are smart and kind and they're pure. And you ask Machiavelli, why do you like the people? Well, they're vulgar, they're impoverished, they're massive, they're sluggish. So even though normatively, Machiavelli does break quite far from how classical authors dealt with the people, descriptively, he's actually in a lot of agreement when the classical authors use the trite proverb of the people as mud. Okay, the people are like mud. This is how Machiavelli responds to that proverb. Let no one resist my opinion on the people with that trite proverb that whoever founds on the people founds on mud. His response is that you can do a lot with mud, okay? You can make bricks out of mud, and bricks make damn good foundations for houses. And now you're at the point to understand why his egalitarianism needs great men. Someone needs to shape the mud into bricks. The mud is not going to shape itself. The very qualities of the people that make them dependable, particularities, not generalities, maintenance on innovation, means that they need a princely figure to guide them, right? So in ordinary political life, even in ordinary political life, when things are going well, you need someone who breaks down the infinite generality of a political situation into digestible particularities, right? Like the Capwin case. That's extraordinary, but even in ordinary case, you need someone like that, right? You need the prince to chew the food until it's mushy enough before he spits into people's mouths. Otherwise, the people are going to choke. That's Machiavelli's point. The people, Machiavelli tells us, are impotent, even in ordinary political life, without a head. But when you need to rescue an existing order that is facing crisis, okay, so this is the extraordinary moment, the people are even more impotent. Because the very qualities that make them so conservative and good at maintaining traditions, sluggishness, vulgarity, mass, decentralized wisdom, makes them incapable of innovation. This is why, even though Machiavelli says, in the long run, the worst people judge better than a worse prince when they're both unshackled by law. And he says, on the upside, they're still better. A good people judge better than a good prince in the long run when they're both shackled by law. Even though he says this, the people are better in the good and bad case, he still thinks that peoples need princes. Why? Someone has to do the shackling. Someone has to establish the law, turn the bad order into a good one. If princes, I quote you Machiavelli, are superior to peoples in ordering laws, forming civil lives, and ordering new statutes and orders, peoples are so much superior in maintaining things. The larger the group, the slower, the more conservative the decisions will be. And that is why, for Machiavelli, the one founds, the many maintains. And he means one. I quote you Machiavelli again. It never or rarely happens that any republic or kingdom is ordered well, unless it is ordered by one individual. This is why Romulus had to kill Remus. Even two is too much to found. But after Romulus kills Remus, this is how you know he's not a tyrant like Agathocles, he sets up a senate. He shares power because the many maintain what the one has founded, okay? And I think it's quite striking when you look at the fastest growing startups in the past few decades that validates this rule of founding by one. All the best companies are by one person, whether it's Facebook and Zuckerberg, Amazon and Bezos, Microsoft and Gates, OpenAI and Altman, Tesla and Musk. Even when there are co-founders, there's a clear leader. And if there's not, there needs to be a knife fight until there is, in the case of OpenAI and Tesla. This co-equal CEO thing, Romulus and Remus, that doesn't work. That's Machiavelli's point. All right. To summarize, the people need great men because they need a singular founder to establish a new order from nothing. That's the extraordinary case. But by extraordinary, Machiavelli doesn't mean set it and forget it. He doesn't mean do this once, never have to do it again. The extraordinary case is going to pop up in moments of crises where refounding is required. Because for Machiavelli, republics are not perpetual motion machines. There's just too many things that can destroy a republic. And so there always requires someone to do the non-constitutional act of a refounding that goes beyond existing institutional barriers. That's the extraordinary case. But even in the ordinary case, the people need a head in order to properly exercise judgment. The people need great men. And the reverse is true as well. If you want to be a singular prince, even if you want to be a tyrant, Machiavelli says, it is wiser to found on the people than the elites. Not because they're more moral, but because positionally they're the more advantageous one. The elites are your rivals, the people are not. You can guard against the elites who are few. You cannot guard against all the people if they hate you. And I think this dual dependence answers a potentially quite puzzling question about Machiavelli, which is how does the same person who writes The Prince, which is a princely work, also write the Discourses, right, which is about republicanism? He clearly prefers republics over principalities because they're more free, they're more dynamic, they're more stable, they're more egalitarian. But for the ideal case of both, the similarities are more than the differences. And the dead giveaway in the Discourses is when he uses the phrase, princes of republics. What the hell is a prince of a republic, right? You know, you think that a republic is something that does not have a prince. He means the great men that are needed for even egalitarian structures. The other giveaway is in The Prince, when he says civic principalities. What the hell is a civic principality? It's the democratic institutions that are needed, even if you want to rule alone. The way you reconcile the two is that he clearly prefers republics, but sometimes you just have to rule in a principality, either because you inherited it or because the people are incapable of freedom. But in both cases, the structure is the same. Prince plus people against the elites. And that insight is going to bring us to part two, the second value of modernity. Freedom requires conflict, specifically class conflict. And after his egalitarianism, I think this idea is probably Machiavelli's second biggest innovation upon political philosophy. Because classical political theory all saw disunion as harmful, as faction, but Machiavelli treats it as productive. A house divided unto itself can stand. Even stronger, only houses divided upon itself may stand. I quote you Machiavelli. Those who darn the tumults between the nobles and the plebs blame those things that were the first cause of keeping Rome free. All the laws that are made in favor of freedom arise from their disunion. So a tumult is what happened at Capua. It's riots, it's violence, it's shouting. And most authors disapprove of these tumults because they see how chaotic it is. But Machiavelli's response is, be a bit more vulgar. Look at the outcomes of these tumults. The people get their catharsis, right? The elites are checked. And even though they are violent, it rarely results in any actual death or exile. Tumults then become the very conflicts, the very mechanism that prevents the elites from exercising their desire to oppress. And the greatest achievement of the tumults is in its own institutionalization, in the creation of the tribunes. Okay, so let me tell you that story now. The tribunes were the plebeian representatives that acted in politics on behalf of the people in Rome, but they did not exist in the early Roman Republic. In the early Roman Republic, there were senators and the consulship. And both offices were explicitly closed off to the plebs, the people. And so without any political representation, the people quickly fell into debt bondage, de facto kind of slavery. And so they decided to secede en masse. All the people left the city. They went to a place, what is called the Sacred Mount, and they threatened to build a second city. Okay, so it was a strike of sorts. And this is the exact kind of tumult and conflict that Machiavelli likes. No blood was spilled, no one was killed, but fear was stricken into the elite's hearts. Because now they realize, okay, we need the people. Someone has to till the fields. Someone has to man the army. And so the elites relented, and they agreed to the creation of the tribunes, okay? The tribunes, they themselves must be plebeian. They were voted for only by plebeians, and their role was to protect, at least initially, the plebeians. So they could veto laws passed by the other magistrates. They eventually could pass their own when consulting with the plebeian council, and they could protect the plebeians, sometimes literally just by shielding themselves physically, because their persons were sacrosanct and inviolable in Roman law. Okay. So what this tumult did wasn't to resolve class conflict, but it was to institutionalize it. And the ideal picture that Machiavelli paints of the early Roman Republic is like a Russian nesting doll, where there's actually two states into one. There's a patrician state that operates not independently, but somewhat autonomously, and there's a plebeian state, okay? So the plebs would deliberate policy in the council, and the patricians would do this in the Senate. The consuls would have the right to punish, but the tribunes would have the right to veto and protect the plebs from punishment, right? And so this is the kind of ideal setup for class conflict. And you'll notice that it's a lot stronger than the current American case. So what Machiavelli has in mind when he says freedom requires conflict is not just class conflict, it's institutionalized class conflict. Okay, he means class-specific institutions. Because in America, everyone can still be president, senator, and a representative in the House. And everyone votes for all three. But in early Rome, at least, if you were poor, you could only elect and be selected for the tribune. And Machiavelli believes that this was good for the people on egalitarian grounds. Okay, why? Because it draws the battle lines very clearly. The patricians are not your friends. Even if those offices are formally open to you, fair elections are not fair. Machiavelli is painfully aware of how the tribunes have been bribed, about how the elites would use religion, unnecessary wars, about how they would use their existing media channels effectively to control and sway fair elections. Wealth and existing political power have a way of turning one man, one vote elections heavily askew in favor of the elites. This was actually, by the way, a very common worry in classical political philosophy, so much so that the Athenians, for the Athenian democracy, a lot of the offices were by lottery, not by election. They would literally choose the downside of incompetence, having someone incompetent in office, than risk the election being hijacked by the rich and powerful. And so I think Machiavelli would say, America has gone completely the wrong direction when it made the Senate elected by the people, right? Because remember, the American Senate, originally as it was designed, was only chosen by the state legislature, not by the people. But in the Gilded Age, there was a lot of corruption. There were some very scandalous and blatant cases of people just buying out the office. And the hope was, like, now that we made this office directly elected by the people, wealth would have less of a corrosive effect, right? How's that working out for you? It's still as influenced by money and wealth. It's no longer explicit corruption or bribery, but it's now super PACs and its donors, it's think tanks and its lobbyists. It's the billions poured into media to direct popular opinion. What America should have done was the exact opposite. Okay? And if you want to read more about this is a proposal by a great Machiavellian scholar, John McCormick, who had an excellent book on Machiavelli's egalitarianism called Machiavellian Democracy. So his Machiavellian proposal is that America should have put a wealth floor on the Senate and the presidency. You can't be in those offices if you're poor. You can't even vote for those offices if you're poor. And then what America should have done is to add a wealth ceiling in the House, okay? Only poor people can vote and hold those offices. Why? Because by expanding democratic access, and this happened in late Rome, by the way, you think the people are getting more control, but fair elections are heavily skewed against the people's voices actually coming out. It will still be dominated by the wealthy, and worse, you're not cognizant of that fact. So what you actually want is class-specific institutions, institutionalized class conflict, so that people know the president, the Senate, they're not your friends, okay? You have to be extra diligent about them, and then you have to pour everything into the House to fight back. Any institution, any movement, not directly oriented against wealth will be hijacked by it. This is one of the corrupting influences that Machiavelli worries about. And to give you, I think, the most extreme, interesting example here, think about identity politics, okay? After 2008, there was a lot of pressure on capital, on wealth, Occupy Wall Street. And then in the 2010s, something very interesting happened. Identity politics had its heyday, and it channeled away the progressive concern for the little guy and the victim away from the axis of wealth towards the axes of race and gender, right? And what that enabled wealth to do was, in that decade, to expand in a way that is not controlled and not contained. And if that wasn't enough, in the late 2010s, a large part of capital itself became woke capital, right? So in the span of less than 10 years, wealth did this incredible judo move where now they're the good guys. Now, Bill Gates is your friend, poor Texas farmer is your enemy. And this just shows you Machiavelli's point about the incredible influence of wealth that can seep into everything, even egalitarian movements. And by the way, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that there's like a secret Illuminati dark room where the people are getting, men in dark suits are meeting every month to coordinate this judo move, but just the emergent behavior of individual actors alone is sufficient to perform it. Because as a business leader, if I need to scratch the egalitarian itch, my own or other people's, it's a lot easier for me to hire a few minorities and turn my logo rainbow colored 1 month every year than it is to actively campaign for the wealth tax, right? That's the intuition. Identity politics siphons away class tensions because it appeals to the very same passions. So conversely, capitalists today who are leading the charge in destroying identity politics are digging their own grave, because wokeism was the catacomb that was holding back their apocalypse. They think they're hacking at the door of their enemy's last final hiding place. They're hacking at a dam. Because without the channels of identity politics, the same people, they're not going to start reading Ayn Rand and buying Bitcoin, okay? They're going to go back to 2008, to class conflict. What you're getting is not a libertarian paradise. It's wealth taxes and unions. It's state-run grocery stores, okay? Of course, Machiavelli would like that, because now the battle lines are actually being redrawn to the actual vector of oppression and conflict. Now you know, Bill Gates, not your friend, poor Texas farmer, he's your friend, okay? And again, let me not make the people here sound so good and the elites always evil, because again, it's positional, not essential. The elites are usually secure in their possessions. So when they want more, according to Machiavelli, they have to take from the people. They want the next thing. The people, they're threatened by the elites. They're at risk of losing everything they have. So the next thing they want is simply to protect the current order and preserve freedom. But in both cases, everyone wants more. Everyone wants the next thing. The poor are just as greedy as the rich. And so Machiavelli says that once the people get too comfortable, they're going to want more and more and more, and this is what happened in Rome. First they got the tribune, then they got the consuls, then they wanted the censorship, then the praetor, and when all the offices were opened up to the people, it still wasn't enough for them. They wanted strong men like Marius, like Caesar, to actively beat down the nobles. That's how the Republic died. It is necessary, quote Machiavelli, to whoever disposes a republic and orders laws in it, to presuppose that all men are bad, and that they always have to use the malignity of their spirit whenever they have a free opportunity for it. Institutionalized class conflict is not just about the poor checking the wealthy, the people checking the elite. It's everyone pointing a gun at everyone else. And this is one of the reasons why Machiavelli advises everyone how to screw everyone else, okay? He's gonna advise the people, this is how you scare the bejesus out of the elites. And then he's gonna turn around and he's gonna say to the elites, this is how you trick the people. In the same chapter in the Discourses that he tells you how to stage a conspiracy, he tells you how to thwart a conspiracy. It's not because Machiavelli is interested in teaching thugs, no matter where they are. It's because he wants to arm everyone against everyone else, right? Ambition, checking ambition, that idea we owe to Machiavelli. And this, it turns out, is not too far from his ideal in foreign policy. Okay, to summarize, we're here to understand in this lecture why principles need to be violated to be realized. Part one is equality. Turns out it needs great men, according to Machiavelli. Part two, we're discussing why freedom requires conflict. You not only need domestic conflict, you also need international conflict, foreign wars. And as I mentioned, I have a separate lecture, which you can go watch, on his foreign policy, so I'm not going to rehash all the arguments there, except to say that his ideal state of how nations and classes within nations should relate to each other are quite similar. Clear boundaries, actively conflictual and hostile, maybe brief bursts of violence once in a while, but not all-out bloodshed, okay? Just everyone keeping everyone else on their toes. All right, that's freedom, part two, requiring conflict, domestic and international. And in order to help you understand the last principle, right, which has to do with the rule of law, I want to introduce that by teasing out an imminent objection to this second idea, that freedom requires conflict. Because as I hinted, conflict is also what destroyed the Roman Republic, right? It started when the public started getting poor and the private started getting wealthy. It's the opposite of what he wants. He wants the private poor, the public wealthy. The issue with that is that soldiers started depending on their generals for pay. And so those private relationships started overriding their public loyalties to the state. Now the tribunes, the magistrates of the people, they try to correct this with what are called the agrarian laws. The agrarian laws, it's essentially a very aggressive wealth redistribution scheme. Elites can't have this. So this basically spirals out of control into private violent conflict until you get the Marius and the Sullas and eventually the Caesar and Pompey's, and eventually the Republic collapses, okay? So that's the challenge to Machiavelli. You say conflict preserves freedom. Why did it end up destroying the Republic? Machiavelli, in the Discourses, explicitly acknowledges this, and his first response is to say, yes, that is true. However, without agrarian laws or without conflicts like these, the Republic would have died a lot sooner. Okay, but can we say something about what conflicts are productive and what conflicts are not? I think Machiavelli, the first answer he'll give is, it's really just a question of judgment. Does this resolve more than it incites, okay? It's a quantity kind of thing. Simmering is good, boiling is not. A little violence is good, a lot is not. And it's just up to the prince's judgment. But I think we can say two more things, because that's not very philosophically interesting. I think we can say two more things about essentially what makes for a good versus bad conflict. The first one is that I think class conflict is healthy, whereas party politics is not, okay? So class conflict is when the plebs banded against the nobles, left, seceded en masse, and got the tribunes. Whereas by the time of the late Republic, Caesar, Pompey, they were technically still operating on class lines. Like Caesar was on the popular side, he was on the plebeian side, but Caesar himself was a patrician, right? He was from one of the great noble families. And so it's not too dissimilar from what we have now in America with Republican and Democrat. It's not drawn on class lines. It's their respective billionaires and politicians leading the people going at each other. And the issue I think Machiavelli sees with party politics is that, like in the case of identity politics, if the vector of conflict is not directly drawn at wealth, that is just going to keep expanding and no one is going to be checking that. And so one thing you could say about why the Republic fell is that the plebs, they actually caused their own destruction by getting too many offices, right? Whereas when they just had the tribune, the class lines were much more distinct. The second thing that separates a productive versus an unproductive conflict is whether it is legal or not. The tribunes were created by the explicit legitimation of the Senate. The Senate explicitly, legally recognized that. But when you get to the late Republic, it's often private feuds. The most notable example is Caesar crossing the Rubicon, right? Explicitly illegal. And that insight is going to take us to the third and final section of this lecture, which is the importance of rule of law. Specifically, law requires violence. Okay, to summarize where we're at. Part 1, equality needs great men. Part 2, freedom requires conflict, domestic and international. And now we're at part 3, law requires violence. So let's first try to understand why rule of law is so important for Machiavelli, with the famous example, Shakespeare made a play out of this actually, of Coriolanus. Okay. So Coriolanus was another Roman patrician, general, statesman of the early republic, and he hated the plebs, okay? And he was very upset that they recently got the institution of the tribunes. So there was a grain shortage. Coriolanus proposes to the senators, let's withhold the grain that we have. Let's starve the people out until they agree to abolish the tribunes that they just got. The people hear this, they're not too happy. They want to tear Coriolanus to shreds and they rush to the Senate until, just like the case of Capua, a tribune, one of the tribunes stops the people. And the tribune says, guys, we have a legal way of doing this, okay? So let's use that legal trial instead of just tearing Coriolanus to shreds. That's what the people did. Coriolanus fled, he was charged in absentia, and the people eventually convicted Coriolanus. This trial is an example of what Machiavelli calls an accusation, okay? The Roman institution of accusations. Anybody in Rome could level a charge at anyone else in Rome, and if the charge and the person were serious enough, everyone together would vote on the outcome. Accusations were important for the same reason the tumults were important. It gives people a cathartic outlet, emotions. It actually takes out dangerous people like Coriolanus, and like the tumults, it just scares the elite, okay? It puts them on tilt. It makes them realize we can't just go around doing everything we want to. So he's a fan. Machiavelli's a great fan of accusations, but he hates what he calls calumnies. A calumny is a private rumor whose facts aren't verified, shared, and debated publicly, and whose resolution is private and not public, mostly through violence. If the tribune hadn't stepped in and the crowd would just, hey, this guy said this, let's tear him to shreds, that would have been a calumny. Okay, so really the only major difference between this thing he loves, accusations, the thing he hates, calumnies, is their legality. Machiavelli's point here is to say it was important that this was legal, not because of Coriolanus, not for his sake. Okay? He's toast already, either way, but for the sake of the Republic. Because if the people just privately tore him to shreds, Coriolanus' friends are going to say, well, that's a private act. Now we're going to get our gangsters and get back at the people. This is how civil wars begin. So the fact that it was an outcome of a public trial gave the accusation a kind of finality, and Machiavelli likes it because it puts an end to violence. But even stronger, Machiavelli goes this is how much he likes rule of law. He goes as far as to say, even extraordinary actions, try to do them legally. Okay, how's that possible? It's possible through things like the dictatorship. It's a legal outlet where you can legally hold tyrannical power, which means that if you design law, you should design law such that certain ways of violating it would still be legal. So the idea that Machiavelli advises just transgressing the law, completely ignoring it, could not be further from the truth. In fact, I quote, "If a citizen is crushed ordinarily, there follows little or no disorder in the Republic." This is the key sentence. "Even though he has been done a wrong. For the execution is done without private forces and without foreign forces, which are the ones that ruin a free way of life." Even a public legal wrong, a false trial, is better than a private right. And here we get to the heart of Machiavelli's philosophy of legality and punishment. Punishment it's not really about punishing the deserving. It's certainly not about rehabilitating the guilty, right? That's what modern punishment is about. It's about vulgarity. It's about the outcome, the effectual truth, the effect of the punishment, which is number one, catharsis for the people, number two, fear for the ambitious, and number three, a kind of awe and respect for the legal order. Okay, I quote to you Machiavelli. Because those executions were excessive and notable, such things made men draw back toward the mark whenever one of them arose, unless something arises by which punishment is brought back to their memory and fear is renewed in their spirits. Soon so many delinquents join together that they can no longer be punished without danger. If the executions had continued at least every 10 years in Rome, it follows of necessity that it would never have been corrupt. It turns out what sustains the legal order is not law. It is spectacle, violent spectacle that renews that order. And by calling it a spectacle, okay, I think Machiavelli is implying it almost has to be unjust. Why? Well, if it's just, it's not excessive. If it's not excessive, it's not notable, okay? So let's say we find a human trafficker and we lock him up, 30 years. That's just. No one's gonna notice that. Now, let's say we legally took this person, their entire family, shot them in Times Square, broadcasted it on all the social media channels. That's unjust, but that's excessive. That's notable. Machiavelli tells us every time France killed one of her kings, the legal order was renewed. Machiavelli didn't say anything about the guilt of those kings. So kill the rich, hack the powerful to pieces. They will not listen to your reason, but they will listen to your violence. If the purpose of law truly, as it is for Machiavelli, in its effect, then what's important is that it appears legitimate, not that it is essence just. All the deserving need to be punished. Not all who are punished need to be deserving. And here, again, I'm a bit of two minds here. I think one reason Machiavelli, remember, accusations are kind of voted for often by the entirety of the citizenry. One reason I think he likes that is because the people, as the case of Capua goes to show, they're good at letting go of their vengeance. So they come out with better judgments. But he also gives examples where the people punish excessively. And I think he also likes that. So accusations are a kind of legalized form of what Girard would call the scapegoat mechanism, where disproportionate blame is given on one individual. And I think Machiavelli wants to say, we actually need that in healthy, lawful society. Regardless of which kind of interpretation I just gave is correct, even in the ordinary maintenance of law, ordinary political life, what is required is lawful but unjust violence to renew its legitimacy. One spectacle every 10 years keeps the doctor away. But what happens if there's no law to begin with? Okay, what happens if the people are so darn corrupt that they can't even respond to law? That's the extraordinary case, and that's going to require a lot more violence. And the most infamous example of this that Machiavelli brings up is Cesare Borgia. Okay, Cesare Borgia was a contemporary Renaissance prince. He was known for his charm and his political acumen, his ruthlessness, his martial prowess. And the episode that Machiavelli highlights from Cesare is one of the most brutal killings in all of his writings. So Cesare comes into possession of the Romagna, one of these regions of Italy. The Romagna was terribly run by weak leaders. There was crime, there was rampant lawlessness everywhere. And in these cases, Machiavelli says, you basically, it's almost impossible to fix it, but the only hopes of fixing it would be a dictator willing to use force. Cesare installs a bastard of a man, Ramiro, who has no moral boundaries, and he just cleans house, and in an unbelievably short amount of time brings back law and order. Now, after they've been uncorrupted, you don't need a dictator anymore. Think about the case of Romulus. And what Cesare did was set up civic institutions, more kind of democratic participation from different parts of the Romagna. And at this point, he has to decide, what do I do with Ramiro, who's my, by all accounts, loyal, certainly effective minister? He kills him. And he kills him in the most spectacular way possible. He chops Ramiro in half, and he puts both halves in the plaza, like the Times Square example I gave you, the central part of the city. And then he puts the wood block, as well as the knife that cut him in half, as if this was a butcher shop. Machiavelli concludes this anecdote. The ferocity of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. Corrupt people can be eliminated, according to Machiavelli. They can be shocked. They can be awed. They cannot be reasoned with. And so this is the kind of violence that is required to found a lawful order from a corrupt state. And if you do this, you must, like Romulus, make it clear that I set the laws, you follow the laws. You cannot have yourself set a precedent of your own brutality as something that future people imitate. Okay, you got to make clear this was extrajudicial. All right. That's the 3 parts, which wraps up the lecture today. And what we are shown is that each of our deepest modern values have been turned on their head. And I promised at the end of this lecture, I would tell you what I think about Machiavelli. So here it is. I have never read a more compelling, a more convincing and faithful account for Epicureanism, for political withdrawal, okay? Because Machiavelli did radicalize me, but he radicalized me in the completely opposite direction that he would have wanted. Okay, he hopes that by surfacing the violent foundations of great societies, I would have license to say, well, now I'm going to do this too. Whereas it just makes me not want to found any great societies. Not because I disagree descriptively with Machiavelli, but I see his point now, how the ordinary is dependent on the extraordinary. Your freedom is founded on waging war on others, okay? Law must be established with excessive force. And the only way an egalitarian order is built is through a tyrannical force that legislates alone. Whereas before I read Machiavelli, I was at least aesthetically attracted, right, to these great founders. But now, even if Andrew Jackson looks me dead in the eyes and says, I want you to come found this grand republic with me, now I think I'll say, no, thank you, okay? How about this? You found the Grand Republic, and I'll immigrate 250 years later when the dust has settled down. True story, by the way. Because now I know what founding requires, okay? And I don't want to touch the extraordinary modes. But this is Machiavelli's brilliance. Even ordinary political life, Machiavelli has completely turned me off of. Why? Because he's convinced me, well, not fully, I don't think everything he says is correct, but he's directionally, I think, correct. Even in ordinary maintenance of political life, the extraordinary is needed. The extraordinary, at the very least, is latent, right? Freedom doesn't require constant warfare, but it does require kind of institutionalized class conflict. Equality doesn't require just tyranny all the time, but it does require populist leaders. And maintaining rule of law doesn't require the kind of Cesare Borgia, Ramiro style, clean the house, but it does require violent spectacle to renew its legitimacy. In other words, what Machiavelli showed me is that not only is the ordinary dependent on the extraordinary in crunch time, okay, in times of founding, refounding crisis, the ordinary always contains, and maybe even stronger, is the extraordinary. And here we find the causal mechanism behind that core insight we started off with, of why principles need to be violated in order to be realized. Because it turns out that ordinary principles themselves contain constitutively within them the demand for their extraordinary counterparts. And this is how Machiavelli teaches us to read politics. Not to read the extraordinary in light of the ordinary, not to use our moral intuitions and judge Andrew Jackson bad, lying, cheatful, deceiving man, but to do the reverse. To read the ordinary, what we get to enjoy today, in light of the extraordinary. You live free because your ancestors were ruthless. If you want to keep living free, you also got to be ruthless. The extraordinary, not the ordinary, is the essence of politics. The enslaved Gallic warrior knows more about who Rome actually is than the senator's trophy wife slurping oysters in Rome, okay? Studying one case of Romulus killing Remus is going to tell you more about the singularity of founding than studying all the org charts on the S&P 500 combined. This is why Machiavelli's books are full of studies of the extreme case, because the extreme is going to tell you more about the normal than the normal itself. And this fundamental Machiavellian insight gave birth not just to modern political theory, but also struck an early tune, an early note for modern science as well, okay? For what is an experiment if not examining nature in the extreme case, splitting the atom, okay? Speeding up, accelerating particles to unfathomable speeds, looking at the micro and the macro. Experiments put nature under stress in the same way you would torture a prisoner to juice out the truth. And in the same way that normally everything hidden in nature emerges when you push nature to the limit, the truth of human nature emerges in extraordinary moments. Andrew Jackson tells you more about what America is than the Beverly Hills mom driving her G-Wagon to Pilates. But not only is science Machiavellian because it's about the extraordinary, science is also Machiavellian because it is terribly vulgar, okay? How is science vulgar? Science cares not about intention, teleology is dead, but only in the measurable outcomes. Science cares not about essence, metaphysics is dead, but only in the observable appearance. That very phrase that Machiavelli uses just once in all of his works, effectual truth, laid a revolution, effectively, for our scientific understanding of truth. Because when we think about truth today, what do we think about? We think about facts, right? How tall is this lectern? How bright is that light? How heavy is this book? Before Machiavelli, that's not what you first thought about when you thought truth. Factum, in Latin, where fact comes from, only means deed, that which is done, not truth. And in Plato, explicitly, the fact is not the true. The real, the material, that is not the true. It is precisely the immeasurable, the essence, the form, that is the true. But with this one vulgar phrase, effectual truth, which must have sounded like an oxymoron to his contemporaries. What the hell is effectual truth? Everything becomes flipped on its head. Truth is no longer in the essence. It's no longer in the ideal. It's in the effect, it's in the deed, in the factum, in the fact. And this, of course, set the stage for modern science. Okay. Why am I going off a tangent and telling you about Machiavelli and science at the end of this lecture? Because I wanted to give you a sense of just how powerful these ideas are with this analogy. Think about everything we've managed to achieve with modern science since Machiavelli. Flight, AI, bioweapons, nukes, cloning, genetic engineering. We became masters over the natural world by learning to see it in Machiavelli's vulgar and extraordinary way. Well, the same mastery awaits the prince willing to execute his ideas on the social world. Thank you.
Okay, so does Machiavelli actually hold his like founding principles as, or his base principles as good, or is it just that they are like instrumentally useful for him to gain power? So like in other words, he likes the populace because it's like this tool that he can use to gain power because he can't hack it in the elite. But like if he could hack it in the elite, would he still think that like the best society should be ruled by the will of the vulgar, or that like appealing to spectacle is actually the best way to get to like this equality freedom thing?
What do you mean if he can hack the elite?
No, like he can't make it in the elite. That's why he like.
Oh, I see. It's a ressentiment kind of point.
No. But like, I guess like does he? So let's say he was a well-heeled elite who could like go that route. Would he still hold freedom and equality as these top principles?
Right. Great. Yeah. So a lot of good points there. Surprisingly, coming from Jeremy. Jeremy was my roommate, so I can make fun of him. And he got me into philosophy, so I have to blame him for that. The first thing I'll say is Machiavelli is not recommending siding the elite only as instrumental ends for a singular prince. Even though he does advise princes, if conditional on they want to rule alone, they should side with the people and not the elite. Because they're numerous, they don't challenge. But when you read Machiavelli, you have to be very careful on whose interests he's advocating for in that exact sentence. So even independently of his advice to the prince, in the Discourses, he's saying, if you want to build a good state for the sake of the state, not for the sake of the prince, you still want to ground it on the people. And this is what I meant by the prince and the Discourses are actually a lot more similar than first meets the eye. So to answer your question, yes, he says to the prince, you should go with the people for instrumental reasons, but he's also saying, for the republic, for stability, you also want to do that. So does that answer your question? And yeah, does that answer your question?
So the commonality is there's always a great man. Basically, he's always contra aristocracy or oligarchy.
Exactly. That's the very interesting insight. And that's also the direction of modern politics, right? Modern politics is the prince and the people squeezing out the elite, squeezing out the aristocracy.
And so it's any means for a great man is basically like whatever puts that person in power.
No, because in a steady state, you don't want a great man.
Okay, a great founder.
Okay, yeah, but you said founder, right? So in a steady state, you don't need a great founder. You don't need Cesare like the entire time. You don't need Ramiro the entire time. Yeah? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, basically he's never in favor of like an aristocracy or an oligarchy, effectively.
That's a really good question. So Venice, he says, has a good nobility. But here's the other thing with reading Machiavelli. He often doesn't literally mean the sentence that he says, because he tries out all these different positions. It's like that science point I ended this lecture with. He's going to try one extreme, and then he's going to try the other extreme. So that's why, by the way, this is how I think you become a great thinker. It's not necessarily to produce great ideas, to produce confusing ideas so that people can get tenure by arguing about it 200 years later. But he says he likes Venice's elites because they're more fluid. I suspect he is saying they are better than the landed gentry. So it's a relative claim. I also suspect he thinks you can't just get rid of the elite. Like, the elite are just there. He's quite praiseworthy of Rome's early Senate, like Cincinnatus and people like that. But usually when he brings up the elite, it's negative. But I do think he thinks you can't really just get rid of this elite class, so you're going to have to design mechanisms to deal with them, either as a republic or as a principality. All right, second question.
Thanks, Jonathan. My question is about, so you've talked a lot about how Machiavelli is trying to disabuse us of sort of delusions. It seems to me that if we started taking Machiavelli more seriously, we would see more of the worst in each other, in the other classes, but also in ourselves. And it seems to me that he's missing an account of how it is that we could sort of see the best in other people in a way that brings it out in them. And I see like the founding of the American Republic as more along those lines of like a self-fulfilling prophecy in the positive direction, where the founding fathers believed in us maybe more than we deserved, and in doing so created the Republic. So how would Machiavelli deal with that?
The founding fathers, what is their attitude to the natives? Like, what is their relationship with the natives? Like, how do you explain that part? Yeah. What's your reading?
I guess they would there's something here about a noble lie, about creating the idea that you're actually, I think, creating the idea that you're the shining city on a hill. And I think Machiavelli sort of seems to condemn this idea or says it's a delusion, but simultaneously, I think he'd admit that it's necessary.
Yeah.
So
okay.
who is being deluded and who is he advising to lie about what?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. One latent question in your question, right, is his morality for everyone? Like, is what he is proposing here, so he clearly writes the prince, he dedicates the prince to the Medici, what's his name? Someone remember his name? Lorenzo, yes, not the Magnificent, but one of the later ones. And he dedicates the Discourses to two of his aristocratic friends who he says they should be leaders, even though they're not yet. So it's clear that the readership is the elite, right? Or the soon-to-be elite who could become the prince. But then the question, I think the one you're raising is, well, but what is everyone else supposed to believe? And this is a question with Nietzsche, right? And I think a popular interpretation of Nietzsche is to say, herd morality is actually good for the herd. The slave morality is in some sense what the people should want, and it's just a bottom conflict of values. So the question is, what is the equivalent for Machiavelli? Does he want the people to also have this realpolitik view? Yeah, that's a tough one. It's not as clear as in Nietzsche. I think the answer is no. So I think you're right in that what the founding fathers did, if you are right, that they created a noble lie, was in some sense the right thing to do. Why do I think that? I don't know. I can't come up with a better answer right now, but I do think that he would agree with you that this morality he's advocating is not for everyone. Yeah, and I'm sorry I can't give you a deeper answer, but there's another question that you touched, which is, isn't this kind of a bad way to live life, right? Like even if it's, I mean, the extreme case of Agathocles, you have to think about your family. You have to think about your dear friends as all in this conflictual way. What would he say to that? He would say, if you're in positions of power, you die, if you don't think about it like that. And that necessity, that's the word he likes, kind of overrides that. He would also probably say that maybe there's a way to segment the cunning political realpolitik person with a family man. I can't remember what TV show was it. It was one of these gangster TV shows, and the gangster's taking his daughter to like a park, and then he sees someone that screwed him, and he goes over and he kills him, and he goes back to like go playing with his daughter, like, and so yeah, maybe that's one thing. And Machiavelli in his own life, although Machiavelli did not prosecute politics in a Machiavellian way, but in his own life, he's probably the philosopher I would most like to hang out with. He just seems like a very, very funny guy. Yeah, I can elaborate if anyone was interested. But yeah, I hope I gave somewhat good answer here. Next question, right behind you.
Yeah. So my central question is: you made comparisons to effectively companies and nations or states. You compared founders to kings, and then also kind of nobles, senate, few, I assume, to shareholders. Do you think there'll be a point in time where customers will get direct power within companies? Do you think that would be a strategy some founders might use?
Yeah, I'm hesitating because I don't know if in this analogy the customers are the people or the customers are the enemy, right? Because the most obvious candidate for the people are the employees. Right, the Senate is the kind of the executive leadership team.
For the employees, wouldn't the employees effectively be just like low-level bureaucrats, using the state example?
Yeah, so I don't know how much I want to stretch my own metaphor, and maybe you're pushing me in the right direction. But to answer your question directly, do I think customers will eventually get certain control? And I think I just interviewed my old professor, Axel Honneth. He's one of these democratic socialists, effectively big on market socialism. And one of the things he advocates in capitalism is not just how things are produced, we all know that, right? But how they are consumed. And so he drew out the intellectual history and the real history of, for example, consumer protection groups that advocated for, I don't know, like food packaging on labels. So to answer your question, I think they already have. Consumers are already wielding power by banding together in these kind of groups in the same way that citizens are. So yeah, maybe that's a very interesting analogy to explore. We'll take the next question right behind you.
Do you think the egalitarian school of thought is compatible with the Machiavellian one? Said differently, why do you think a Machiavellian-like character is so rare among the egalitarians?
I maybe want to challenge your premise about whether egalitarian characters, why Machiavellian characters, sorry, are rare among egalitarians. Caesar was egalitarian. Literally, he was part of the Popularis faction. Napoleon was an egalitarian, right? So that's one way to respond to your question. Another way to respond why Machiavellian characters are so rare in general is part of what makes a good Machiavellian is that people don't know you're a Machiavellian. So the ideal is not just a wolf, it's a sheep in wolf's clothing. Sorry, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, yeah. That would not be good. that would not be good, yeah. That would be that would be a stoic. Yeah. Not to keep teasing my Stoic friends, but which I have none left after my lecture. And to answer your last question, whether it's compatible with egalitarianism today, there's many schools of thought of egalitarianism, so I suppose it's compatible with one of them. You should look into John McCormack's work. It's really interesting. I think he goes a bit too far. And if anyone's interested, just to give people an overlay of the scholarly landscape, there's largely, I would say, three kind of rough camps. One is the Cambridge School, and that's Skinner, Baroli, whom I've interviewed, and they're all about, getting at the historical reality and how that influences the work. And they lean more towards a classical Republican school of thought. Then there's the Straussian school, okay? This is where stuff gets exciting. Strauss and Mansfield, whom I've interviewed. And they kind of go crazy. Where I got the science bit at the end, that was Mansfield's book. He literally thinks that like Machiavelli is the origin point of modernity that spawns modern science and all these things. I think that's a bit too far. And then there's McCormack's, I wouldn't say school, that's the newest one. And he's egalitarian. He himself is quite egalitarian. And I suspect that he would have liked the policy I described, where you kept the class-specific institutions. And so there's certainly strands of egalitarianism that it's compatible with, but most egalitarianism today is not built on the fact that people are vulgar and sluggish and massive, and and so I think but it is a challenge to modern egalitarianism, which is like, you say that people are good in all these different ways, wisdom of crowds, even here we have someone who agrees with you, but still we need a great man, right? Do you want to ask a follow-up question?
I guess I would like to hear from you about why you think modern day democratic socialists seem awfully ineffectual, holding Mamdani aside. Mamdani seems to be a Machiavellian-like character. But before that, since LBJ, all these, let's call them democratic socialists, the people who care for the working class, they seem awfully, awfully ineffectual. They seem awfully anti the idea of, the end justifies the mean, etc. And I'm curious if these two schools of thoughts of caring for the everyday man is somewhat at odds with Machiavellian thinking. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
That's helpful, yeah. Yeah, so maybe we need to distinguish democratic socialists from other egalitarian schools, right? Because, for example, the Bolsheviks, they were not ineffectual at all. And why do the democratic socialists, why do they seem impotent, right? That's kind of your intuition. It's because of the democratic part. And this, I think, is Machiavelli's challenge to the socialists, which is like, if you actually want to do with this, right? You can't vote your way. The very qualities that make the people dependable require them to be led by singular leaders. Again, I don't know, and for all these lectures, I don't know if I fully agree with it yet, but I can see his intuition, right? And so I think the idea that we can, if you want to be for the people, it can't be by the people. You see what I'm trying to say here, right? It has to be, it has to be for the people by singular leadership. And that has all these different issues that we talked about. You basically end up needing a wise sage king, glory-seeking sage king like Romulus, that's willing to found and then holds up a senate. Great. Let's get another person. You can just, in the corner.
I was first introduced to Machiavelli when I was a senior at a very liberal high school, and they kind of gave us a parental advisory warning ahead of time. That was something along the lines of, actually similar to what you said, accidentally, which is that this is a sheep in wolf's clothing, which is that
Machiavelli is? Or?
Machiavelli is, that he was actually like a sycophant, and he wrote The Prince because he was like out of the job, which is why he dedicated it to those two different people. Because he's basically like, you two are going to be princes and you're going to need an advisor. And let me tell you, I know a lot about being a prince, but he was like secretly a kind of like liberal Republican in the sense of like he believed in republics. Do you consider that an accurate critique? And then do you think it actually impeaches in a meaningful sense the credibility of kind of the points he's making if the goal was to basically have an extended cover letter for an advisory job to a prince?
Great, excellent question. And one that has been raised throughout kind of the ages. There's a few popular explanations of why this book was written. One of them, what you described are actually two combined into one. One of them is, this is actually ironic, okay? It's telling you this is how a prince should act, and what it hopes to elicit is kind of my response, to get you to hate the princely way, right? And Rousseau takes this reading. And Rousseau himself, of course, is somewhat of a Republican, and so he says Machiavelli is one of us. That's essentially what he's saying. That's one reading. It's ironic. Another reading, this is Mansfield's reading, is that this is not a political work at all. It is a philosophical work. And what it wants to introduce, Mansfield has a book about the effectual truth, is this idea of the effectual truth. It engenders a fundamentally new paradigm, a philosophical, not a political primarily, paradigm, where modern science and everything gets invented. That's the number two explanation. And then there's a, man, I really need a job. I'm gonna write kind of explanation. And then you have Veroli's explanation. This is more of the Cambridge School explanation, which says that he was a genuine patriot. And this school kind of, Veroli at least, plays down a lot of the extraordinary stuff and plays up a lot of the follow the law, which is there in Machiavelli. What do I think? I think the Rousseauian school is wrong. Like, I think the ironic reading is wrong. If you read just The Prince, that you might be able to sustain that. But if you read the Discourses as well, you would have to say, the Discourse is also ironic, right? And this is what I'm saying, but these two books actually have a lot more in common than they first appear. Like in the Discourses, there's no less brutality you need in a republic. So I think he's being totally sincere here when he's giving these advices. So I don't think that school's right. I think the job application is not that far off because you read in his private correspondence, like, man, I really want a job right now. and then he wrote his greatest comedy, some people consider it the greatest comedy in Italian comedy, The Mandrake. He wrote that dedicated to the Medici wedding, and it began with like a job plea, basically. So that's not that far off. So my reading would be something like that, plus Mansfield's reading, that he wants to engender an intellectual revolution. He's not trying to, he hopes that he gets a redeemer of Italy. This is what the book ends with, someone who redeems Italy. But I think he realizes that's not very likely. But what he wants to do is to teach future generations how to better do politics. So I do think he wants to engender some kind of intellectual revolution. I don't think it's as philosophical as Mansfield makes it think. So I think it's a combination of, maybe genuine job offer. That's actually only about maybe 10%. 80% is his own glory and getting at becoming a founder of sorts, right? And then he may have 10% hope that this is actually going to educate a great leader to save Florence. Great. Next question. Let's bring it up to Jake here.
Your lecture reminded me of a line from Strauss on Machiavelli, who said something to the effect, the there's no sure protection against the understanding of something than taking for granted or otherwise neglecting the obvious and the surface. The problems inherent in the surface of things and only in the surface of things are the heart of things. So on that, few questions. One, do you agree with that? Or is there another sort of central insight that, methodologically that you've learned from Machiavelli? And relatedly, has reading Machiavelli these last few times changed at all your way of reading Machiavelli or other texts? If so,
yeah.
Happy
Could you say what you think that means? That line means from Strauss? Not because I don't understand it, but because I understand it too well that I don't want to. Yeah. Yeah, but
I think it speaks for itself.
Okay. Great. So what I took from that line, and Jake, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that the importance, contra the wise philosophers, what must be wrestled with is the effectual truth, is the exterior and the obvious and the parent, and not try to dig at the essence. Like sometimes, I can't remember who said it, like when your enemies tell you who they are, believe them. Right? Don't try to like judo your way into thinking, oh, I know, there's a great kind of reading here. And if that's what that line means, which who knows, I would say, I would certainly agree with Machiavelli agreeing with that. Although I do think Machiavelli, even himself, has this kind of probing quality to him, right? And this is what makes him and someone like Girard, someone like Nietzsche, so appealing to read, which is he's like, this seems to be A, it's actually not A, right? Like, I'm gonna show you how freedom requires conflict, how equality requires great men, how law requires violence. So maybe I'll retract a bit my statement, and maybe I'll say that's what the vulgar do. But that is a step above the wise men, right? The vulgar judgment is better than the wise man's judgment. But I think the elite judgment, when he says you touch people, not just sight, that is the actual mode that he actually wants. That's what Machiavelli is teaching you. And again, the elites use that mode, but their problem isn't that they have raw political bad judgment, it's that their biases kind of surface up. To your second question of how has reading Machiavelli changed how I read other texts, I don't think it's surprising that Machiavelli is one of Strauss's most engaged with classical authors, because he's very hard to pin down for the reasons I described. He's going to examine all these different positions, and then he's couched in these layers of potential irony. Or I can definitely see why reading Machiavelli would turn you into a Straussian. I don't know how valid carrying that insight into the other authors is, but yeah, thank you. Next question, who else wants to? Jason.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could, Jonathan, give a substantive, maybe Steelman view of what Machiavelli thinks a powerful elite can do. Because I think in your lecture, you talked a lot about Machiavelli's ideal being a very strong man, at least in an extraordinary circumstance, a very strong man allying with the people, and the elites are sort of there to be leapfrogged. But he also admires Rome, and he talks about in the Discourses, Rome is great because it can produce so many Scipios, so many Catos, so many Ciceros that none of these people can actually take over the tyranny because there's so much glory and so much virtue and ambition, right? And he even talks about, look, the people don't want to rule; they just want to not be ruled. But you need enough glory seeking in society to have enough good people that are going to be these founders or these elites. So, yeah, I just wonder, in a world where he gets his wish, there is a strong ruler, and they're very allied with the people. You have this decaying of glory seeking. You have the lack of this conflict that is needed at the elite level. So what is the role of the elite, right, in a more substantive form, other than just to be leapfrogged by this great founder?
That's a great question. Yeah. All right. So to rephrase the question, you're asking, what does the ideal elite class look like? Because so far what we talked about is the prince and the people squeezing them, right? And that's a great question. I have a few potential answers. I don't really know. One potential answer is what I said about the private poor and the public being rich, right? And that is just Cincinnatus is your great example. And one way, and I struggled a lot to think like, if he's so down on the elites, what is their function in society? Like, is it just, as it was in the previous answer I gave, is it just because you can't get rid of them, right? That's one answer. You can't get rid of them, we have to figure out how to deal with them. I think it's a bit stronger. I think, to your point, there is a good form of the elite. One has to do with a lot of austerity. So the elite must separate themselves on virtue, not classical virtue, Machiavellian virtue, and not wealth. Cincinnatus. Number two, one result of this is he has one chapter in the Discourses where he says, look how Rome fastly it was able to swap positions, right? The consulship, there's two of them. It's only for a year. And he praises how last year you were the consul, I was a praetor, I was underneath you. Next year, I'm in command, you obey me without any kind of, like this guy who, who used to be my employee, basically, now is my boss. Like there's none of that. And that again has to do with, I think, virtue, Machiavellian virtue, being the top hierarchy. So that's one answer, is a fast, fluid ability to swap in and out, grounded on virtue and not wealth being the hierarchy. Another possible answer is as a staging ground for the elites. This is probably one of the best answers I can come up with, which is that where do the elites come from? They may come from the people, but they're probably going to come from the patricians. I think that's what Machiavelli would think. Machiavelli, by the way, he himself is part of the patrician class. He was in a family that had kind of fallen out of favor. So did Shakespeare, by the way. His mother was part of the Arden line. And it's very funny because you hear these patricians talking about their poverty or how low class they are. And it's like, Cicero saying, oh, come visit my lowly life raft. And that lowly life raft turns out to be like a 20-acre estate in Tuscany, And because for them, poverty just means the lowest of the elite, right? Which is why Cincinnatus was so surprising, right? The guy only had 2.5 acres of land. He was actually impoverished. So I think Machiavelli would say as a staging ground of these great men, and that actually nicely ties everything we talked about together, right? And that's part of the being able to swap kind of in and out very fast, grounded on virtue. Yeah, great. Kobe.
Thanks, Jonathan. There's this unexamined distinction between moments of political necessity and founding moments, and then the steady state, where only in moments of political necessity and founding moments is it necessary to violate principles in order to enable those principles to be borne out. And my question for you is, does Machiavelli dwell or expand on what actually constitutes a founding moment in the first place? In other words, how is a prince to know if they ought to use the tactics that he suggests?
So the first clarification I'll say is, I don't think it's just founding moments where these extraordinary modes are used. In fact, this is why I said reading him has turned me off of even of ordinary political life, because I think even there it's latent. And maybe an example here is class conflicts, right? Like the class conflict just needs to be there, even in the healthy state. In the political decision, yeah, so that's one thing I'll say. But regardless, your question is still valid, which is, how do we tell? How is a prince supposed to know? And a lot of these questions, a lot of these answers are simply just going to be on your judgment. And this is why he wants you to read history. He wants you to imitate great men. He wants you to imitate specifically your founders and your ancestors. And this is why I introduced it with the American example, because it's only by reading these stories, it's almost like a machine learning algorithm, okay? There's no explicit rule I can give you. You just have to train enough data where you just go, okay, I gotta do this action then. And if you read Machiavelli close enough, you'll find an opposite for almost everything. So at the end of Discourses, book 3, he's going to say how, I can't remember, Scipio's humanity was more impactful as a leader than Hannibal's cruelty. Okay, he usually is the opposite, right? He usually wants to emphasize how cruelty is important, but then he kind of teases out, this is when humanity is important. So every time you read Machiavelli saying you should do X, there's usually a situation where he's going to say, even if very subtly, you should do not X. And then what's really nice about Machiavelli, maybe this is why people consider him proto-political scientist, is he's gonna lay out the constitutive conditions of when to do X and not X. And so I'll give you one last example. Usually it's republics that are better, but sometimes you just gotta do a principality. When do you have to do a principality? Number one, you inherited a principality. Number two, the Ramiro situation. The people are just way too corrupt. And so I know that's not a satisfying answer, but it's judgment, but at least he tells you the way to perfect your judgment, and that's imitation of great men. Great. Maybe two more questions. Yeah, in the back.
I want to talk about the practicality side of it. So you said that this has turned you off from political life. So then what is the right path?
I mean, I was never turned on by politics. This turned me off even more. Okay. I would point to you Machiavelli's own life. Machiavelli won the most glory by being an author. And there, I think, and in book 2, he says, he's ranking the founders, and the religious founders are the best ones. The political founders are the second best ones. And he ranks philosophers as like 4 or 5, which he himself would be. But then I think again, this is why it's so difficult to see if that's actually his opinion. I think in the preface of book 2, he kind of flips that a bit. Mansfield's reading is that he thinks that philosophers are actually the top founders, but he's disguising that because Machiavelli is saying, no, great political leader, you're actually the best. Why? Because it's going to get them to execute his designs. So it's a fraud. He's like tricking them. That's not what I'm doing. And if I were, I wouldn't tell you otherwise. So, but yeah, I suppose that's one direct answer, which is I think, like, clearly the literary path is just the Pareto efficient path. You get more glory. You should think about it. Who has more glory today? Cesare or Machiavelli? Machiavelli. Who has more glory? Plato or Pericles? Plato, clearly. And so you get more glory. Your life is more enjoyable. You don't have to kill anyone. Yeah, and so that I think is this is why I'm a big fan of Aristotle's, the contemplative life. You get it all, yeah. All right, last question. Troutween, let's bring it up.
Yeah, so I was curious about the selection of Andrew Jackson as kind of your example. I would have kind of thought Lincoln would be a more canonical example, both in terms of just the role he played in shaping modern America and the more just explicit tensions with the Supreme Court.
Yeah, could you elaborate for people who, like me, don't understand? Yeah.
Yeah, Lincoln, he was only on the ballot in like the northern states. And then there was a prolonged fight with the Supreme Court around the suspension of habeas corpus. There was concern around the middle states seceding. And so their solution was to basically arrest a bunch of people they viewed as basically secessionists or potential secessionists. And the Supreme Court was not happy with this, given that habeas corpus is protected in the Constitution. And Lincoln is obviously kind of viewed, Andrew Jackson's viewed as very controversial. Like, there's not that many people who, if you go around saying that Andrew Jackson's your favorite president, that's going to like raise eyebrows. Lincoln, however, is viewed as just to Machiavelli's point, much more central to building America into what it is today.
Great, thank you for the great question. So first of all, I don't know American history well, so I didn't even know that. That's the most obvious reason why I didn't use that. I chose Jackson because the betrayal was most similar to Rome's betrayal, and I wanted to use Machiavelli. I wanted to have people here realize, like, this is not just about some classic old republic back then. Like, these things still matter. But there is a really good thing about using Lincoln, which is that, to your point, people already don't like Jackson. And so people will be like, oh, well, of course he did this. But Lincoln, to your point, him violating the Supreme Court would be more like, hey, even your best ones do this. An example that Machiavelli uses is Moses here. Moses is one of his favorite leaders because he calls a massacre in Exodus 32. And there's a reading where Moses actually lies, saying God called the massacre. And that is just striking in the way that you're describing, because we think Moses is a good guy. I mean, he's the best guy in the Jewish tradition. He remains one of the top prophets, right, in the Christian tradition. I have a whole other lecture just talking about unpacking Moses and the founding of Israel. But yeah, so I hope that, sorry I didn't get to link it. Maybe next time. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching my lecture. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also transcripts, book notes, and invitations to future lectures. Now, if you like this lecture, I have many more filmed, as well as interviews with some of the top Machiavelli scholars in the world. You can find links to those episodes and everything else we discussed in the description and on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.